Welcome to Dungeon Masters Guild Community Jam. Thank you for joining us, one bookshelf on your lunch break. If you have never tuned into Community Jam before, or you don't know what Dungeon Masters Guild is, well, thank you for coming to jam with us anyway. Dungeon Masters Guild is the go-to marketplace for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. You can find rule supplements, campaigns, or just modules, player options, pretty much anything you could possibly want in 5th edition D&D is there. And if it's not, you can publish it yourself. So it's an awesome place for creators as well. Speaking of, Community Jam is all about talking to some of our amazing community creators. And we've got two awesome ones with us today again. So let's do some introductions. Let folks know who you are and maybe some of your creations they might know you from. We'll start with Willy.
Sure thing. It's the Willy Boo at the Willy Boo, fun posting online and having a good time. You might know myself and Leon for such hits as the Book of House. I know I have more than just that, of course. Necromancy can be good. That was a good one. Culinary weapons, grunts. We've done a couple of different things that you might have found on the DMsGuild. It's a bunch of really weird, kind of gonzo, kind of not gonzo, kind of creepy stuff. So, yeah, we like clowns over here. So.
Very cool. And then we also have joining us Jack.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm at HoneyBadger3495 on Twitter. I am probably most known for my Titans series. I released 2 supplementary books on Kaiju, on the DMsGuild, Titans of Faerun and Titans of the Ancient World. I really generally deal with big, large, dynamic monster fights that push your party to the limit, and are really made for either parties that are just itching for a beatdown, or DMs who are just really sadist, you know?
Yes, the theme of the jam today is monsters. Or my favorite joke that only this panel gets, like, for real, monsters. Because last time we tried to do this, my power went out. If you have questions for either Willy or Jack about designing monsters, this is a questions-friendly show. So ask in the chat with question in all capital letters, and our lovely moderator, Meredith, will capture that for us so we can ask either at the end or sporadically throughout. But while you're thinking of questions you want to ask these two, let's start off with a little bit of background. I would love to hear what your D&D origin stories are, and then how you transition from playing D&D to becoming a designer on Dungeon Masters Guild. And we'll start with Willy again.
Sure. So my experience with D&D goes back to 3.5 when I was wee little. At this point, we played one game with 3 friends, and then we never played again. But I was so hooked on it. I bought the books. I was checking out all the art, and I even created a class. I think that was kind of neat. But never played after that point. Didn't even play all through high school and through most of college. I didn't get back to D&D until I was done with college. But yeah, we started playing a game, and by this point, I already knew I wanted to be sort of a game designer. So I already had that kind of working in the back of my head whenever I was playing. But eventually, when it became my opportunity to start DMing my own game, I was also cooking up some designs in the background. And sure enough, we found out about the DMsGuild, Leon and I, and we put something on it.
That's really cool that you started way back when you first discovered D&D doing player options, and DMsGuild, you came out I can't think of the phrase. There's an actual phrase. My brain is saying came out like a roller coaster, but I'm like, that's not a phrase. You came out swinging. There we go.
There it is.
With the Book of House, a bunch of really spooky, quirky player options. Jack, what about you?
Well, I think with most people who started in 5th edition, my first foray into D&D was Ravenloft. I played in my friendly local game stores Adventures League of Curse of Strahd. Played my first character was a Goliath monk named Tonk, who was voraciously devoured by gnolls his very first session.
No.
And
we remember Tonk.
I love the gothic horror aspect of Ravenloft so much that I wanted to transpose it to other settings as well. So after playing that, I DM'd Curse of Strahd, which eventually stemmed into a Eberron esque campaign as they escaped the Dread Domain. And then my first foray into DMsGuild was one of my players was like, I want to play the Ranger, but I don't really like the spells and stuff like that. And I was like, I got you. And I made this class called the Jaeger, which essentially revolves around fighting monsters.
Very cool. So again, interesting talking about y'all both being interested in sort of the gothic horror Ravenloft aspect of D&D, which is very timely, accidentally timely, given the release of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. So we're definitely going to delve a little bit into talking about spooky monsters, I think. But to just start us off talking about designing monsters, what draws you to designing monsters?
You want to start?
Yeah. So when I design monsters, I want to provide like a dynamic and interesting, almost cinematic experience for my players, while also challenging them and challenging them to think creatively and to make the most of their abilities. So I don't want just like a bag of hit points or anything. I want a monster that causes them to think, causes them to react, and causes them to like feel as well.
Ooh, I love those that breakdown of different categories. Willy, what about you?
I'm very much drawn to the structure of the stat block itself, right? You just get a whole bunch of tools to play with. It's like this boiled down essence of the game as a whole. And being able to try new things within that stat block. And if it doesn't work, you can throw it away and create a whole new stat block if you want. It's very dynamic in what you can do with it. And being able to kind of like change a creature by changing one trait in the stat block itself is powerful. Especially when you come up with a whole bunch of different ideas in any given day. It's a great focus. It's a cool space to play in.
Yeah, it's very much with that that idea that sometimes it's easier to be creative if you're working within like particular like boundaries or like a box or a little stat block. Okay, whatever. Words are hard for me today, apparently. Everyone, don't bully me. I want to dive in a little bit more into what Jack mentioned, sort of the different aspects of a monster that makes them compelling to you. So I'm wondering what makes a compelling monster? And then because a lot of folks are creating campaigns for Ravenloft, what makes a horrifying monster and how are those things different? Jack, you look like you've got some thoughts.
So I think specifically for horror monsters, I think what really grips me and compels me when I make monsters is I want to make a monster that I really love making like mimic monsters, not like mimic as in the D&D monster, mimic as in like this thing is so good at passing for a human that it can convince you for maybe 1 or 2 minutes, but the more you talk to it and the more you interact with it, the more you notice that subtle things are off about it. Just this very much creeping, revulsing sense of dread that builds as the more you interact with this creature. I created a creature called the Goat Man for my Cryptids Inc. setting, and his entire ability is to mimic something perfectly, except he cannot recreate intonation and meter of things. So it just sounds like someone individually saying each of the words in the sentence, and that's how you tell it's him mimicking something instead of just somebody speaking.
Oh, that's spooky. Very uncanny valley. Yeah. I like how our reactions are like, Lysa, I don't like that. Willy, yes. Willy, do you have any initial thoughts?
Yeah, it's for me, it's pulling it back a little bit. I enjoy sort of, or rather, what makes a monster compelling for me is the impact that it leaves on its audience, right? Whether it might do something unique to them, like throw them across the room or hold them up 30 feet in the air while the water starts to flood underneath, or it might even reflect a character flaw or bond that a person has. I think those sort of like moments where the person can reflect on their own experience versus the monster is what makes them have more of a lasting impact. When you put it in a horror context, what that usually says to me is you want to be able to make something that is unknowing, like I don't know what's going to happen, or something seems off, like the goat man's means of talking to people and what have you.
I really don't like it.
We're all just goat men here. Don't worry about it. And then the other aspect is sort of things that maybe not necessarily takes away player agency, but limits the things that they can do in a situation that starts to make them feel trapped. Building up that sense of horror, oh, I can't do anything about what's about to happen, what is about to happen, and leading back into that idea of the unknowing. Well, what is going to happen next? And usually, more often than not, that might be death, but sometimes it could be worse than death. Like, oh no, I am stuck in a hole and there are snakes down below and I can't get out. So
drilling into what both of you think of as compelling characteristics of monsters, is there a monster in 5th edition D&D, or I guess it could be any edition, if you give us a little bit of background info, that an existing D&D monster that you find particularly compelling and inspiring as a designer?
Ooh. Well, I've got one idea, only because Leon and I talked about it a little bit earlier before. It's a little different, but the Ankeg is a fun monster to play with in that regard. So the Ankeg basically drills underneath the ground. It has tremor sense. It can stay there silently waiting for someone to come below it, and then all of a sudden just reach out, snap, and one fell swoop movement, just pull a person right underneath the ground. And as soon as they pull you under the ground, well, that might just be it for you. But in addition to that, there are other unique aspects of the Ankeg that I noticed from the stat block. Like, oh, if you knock it prone, its AC goes down. And they make note of that. So you can immediately tell, oh, you can knock this thing on its back and it's got a weak underbelly. And that's really cool things to play with. And that can create some great moments when the characters realize those same moments or those same aspects.
Mm-hmm. I think of the core D&D, the monster that I feel is the most interesting and the thing I can play with the most is Baphomet. Because he can, I ran him against my players one time, and he can just trap somebody in a maze, and then all you hear behind you as you're trying to run away and escape this dark, fetid hallway is just like the gentle, like thud, thud, thud of his hooves against the stone, and just the of his snort as he pursues you through the maze. And it's such a fun encounter.
I just feel like this episode's theme is just lists of things Lysa is discovering she hates. But I guess it's monsters, right? They are always scary if they're not a helpful monster for you, not a helpful creature. I feel like I just love monsters that have compelling little tidbits that you can use from their lore. For example, in 5th edition, when they made it so that beholders reproduced by dreaming about other beholders, I feel like that small little bit of lore behind them gives you a lot of possibilities to play with. I also find banshees to be a really compelling creature for that same reason. I want to know what all of their individual backstories are.
Oh yeah.
Beholders are my favorite D&D monster ever because they are the most Lovecraftian eldritch horror thing in D&D, and the designers decided, or the lore writers decided to give it the exact personality of H.P. Lovecraft as well.
Yeah, it comes built in with this character that you can immediately see once you know that a beholder is here. Everyone has sort of that same idea of a beholder in their head.
Yeah. Let's break that down, actually. What do you think makes beholders so heckin' iconic?
I think it's because there's so much room for interaction with beholders. I have ran 3 different named beholders against my party, and each one has been so drastically different while still being within what a beholder can be. The first one is a crime lord beholder named Nyx, who is actually her telekinesis ray. But because she's too proud to say that, she is whenever she gets mail from somebody, she'll go, read it for me. I can read it, of course, I can open it and read it, of course, but I want you to do it for me. And everybody's like, okay. And then the other one is a beholder who takes. So beholders are rooted in like nihilism, like the universe is vast and empty and meaningless and stuff like that. This beholder is an absurdist of like they look at that of the emptiness and meaningless of the universe and go, great. That means if it's so vast and so meaningless, then it means we can explore it as long as we want to and discover new things, and we can create our own meaning for ourselves. So they're what I would say like a good aligned beholder is, if adhering straight to like the good evil axis of D&D alignment.
Ooh.
I love that the range that you can have, but still have the creatures be unquestionably beholder.
Right.
It's true. When I think of beholder, I think about that smile, that damned smile. Just that big toothy grin and sort of like the maniacal laughter that could come out of it in particular. I've run megalomaniacal beholders. I've run just maniacal beholders at this point. But the one story that sticks out in my head is actually more of a spectator, which are your mini beholders, not the tiny ones, but the one step up, I guess is what it is.
Okay, so not like the gazers are the teeny tiny ones, right?
Yeah. The spectator's a little bigger. I think it has 5 eyes rather than that's right. And they're usually there to guard an area. But one of my players challenged the spectator to like a bet. And because the spectator is feeling so high and mighty, it's like, okay, yeah, I agree to the terms of your bet. And the player won, and the spectator didn't do anything to him. So it's like, okay, cool. You were faced in this moment where you could have possibly died, and you chose a different route. You went through the mind versus through its teeth. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I feel like what I'm hearing from both of you is that the fact that beholders are intelligent creatures gives you a lot of room to give them lots of personality and make them compelling and interesting that way. I mean, in addition to being super powerful, like some things are like overpowered, but it's randomized which rays they use and that sort of thing. So it balances out that way. And just the basically essentially like area of effect of different types of beholders having different types of things coming out of their main eyeball means that beholders can be easily customized and still very surprising.
Oh, definitely.
That anti-magic cone too is also really cool too, because a lot of people do go the magic route of beating up monsters, and having that automatically turn off spellcasters immediately it presents an immediate like, oh, bad troubles moment.
Yep. Yeah. And I think, Willy, you'd mentioned that you liked when monsters like immediately face the characters with some sort of puzzle they need to solve. Like you take something away and they need to go around that, or so it has that element as well.
It sure does. Like, oh, make him look behind his shoulders. He doesn't have shoulders. Make him believe he has shoulders.
That's one way, I guess. I've never thought of approaching a beholder with that strategy, but I love it.
Along those lines of thinking, one of my players got Nyx to fight a literal Fae, archfey, by going, this Fae thinks it's so much more powerful than you. And of course we know that you're not. We know that it's not. We know that you're really powerful, but like it doesn't believe you. So you should probably go over there and like show them like what you're made of, you know. Yeah. And the Nyx is like, I'll show them. Yeah, I'll show them. And like went over there and killed the Fae for him. And it's such an easy way. Like a monster that you can like sit down and like manipulate like it was a person, I think is the best kind of monster. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not to say that like mindless monsters aren't fun to run as well, because there's nothing better than having like the Strigoi jump out at a creature or jump out at a player, only for the player to like hold up a holy symbol and have the Strigoi like flesh burning and curdling off its skin recoil back in horror with like a deathly shriek. I mean, that's also another kind of really cinematic, fun aspect of a monster.
Yeah, with your more mindless monsters in particular, there's another element to it besides just playing with the person's mind. You're working with what are they doing, and I think playing with the verbs of those kinds of monsters is always very compelling too.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Like, you can't reason with them. There's a little bit of fear instilled because, in a way, they're just not going to stop. Some of them. I suppose some will stop out of instinct. But would you classify a beholder as a horror genre monster? I mean, you describe them as Lovecraftian, so I suppose that is a genre of horror. But I don't necessarily associate them with, say, Ravenloft, for example. Although, is there a beholder domain? There's an Illithid domain. There should be a beholder domain.
Ooh. I mean, I put beholders in the weird category, right? Like, they can fit within other genres in general. Like, just playing with the Xanathar and Dragon Heist. Oh, you're playing with a mob boss in that case. Or if you are putting them into a horror setting, it might be a death tyrant that has completely wiped out an area and claimed it as its own. They're very flexible in what you can do with a beholder. So you could put it into a horror setting like that, especially if it's an ego one too.
I think that each monster has an adjective attached to it that like gets at its core concept, and I think the adjective that's attached to beholder isn't like fear or like horror; it's power. Because the beholder is all about power over perceived power over like humans, perceived power over the creatures it manipulates, and its own like pride in its power. And I don't think that really fits well within a horror setting, because it's the what your players see when they encounter a beholder is something that's it's more like a king or like a regal monarch than like a something that stalks in the shadows.
True. So, the mists of Ravenloft specifically have probably given beholders a pass, because otherwise it would be all beholders. If you get sucked into Ravenloft as a punishment for what you've done. Well, then my question then is there an iconic D&D horror monster? Something that you've seen in Van Richten's guide that you really love, or something in past editions of Ravenloft?
The Bagman and Van Richten. Oh my gosh, we talked about it before the stream. That is the best core D&D monster I've ever seen. It is so scary because it first of all, as a horror monster, it doesn't make the party feel safe at all. And that's very hard to do in 5e, is make your party feel unsafe. It's the way the art for it is creepy.
It's so horrible.
It's like loosing out of the bag to like.
It's like a monster crawling out of a bag at you. Very, very terrifying.
I just want a juice box.
And I think playing it as like a predator is like the way to go for it too, because it's like it is predatory in the sense that like it's not going to come out and like go like a knockdown drag out fight with your party. It's going to go in and like grab whoever it thinks the weakest member is and just be like, all right, bye, bringing him back inside the bag now.
Gosh. Willy, are you team Bagman or do you have something different?
Besides reacquainting myself with werewolves and lycanthropes lately, I do enjoy my werewolf buddies. Just sort of the story of losing control or getting in touch with your inner beast and what have you, and the stories you can play with that are always compelling to me. I love the horror aspect behind a werewolf. But also another vanilla answer, I'm also a big fan of vampires in that regard too. I like the idea that, oh, hey, any kind of food that they eat turns to ash unless it's blood. And that's why they're hungry. They can't really feel anything. They want to feel, so they go to these extreme lengths in order to have that feeling of being alive again, making themselves feel all like sophisticated and whatnot. That's all just them playing out this grotesque mockery of life. And I think that's really cool to play around with. I mean, you have other versions of vampires to that regards, but that's the one that I keep with me when it comes to horror.
I mean, they're classic horror monsters for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
I interrupted you, Jack.
I'm sorry. I was gonna say that I love the if you guys are familiar with the Vampires the Masquerade setting, there's a bloodline called the Ventru, which is, I think, the most iconic portrayal of vampires as like a sort of blood-sucking authority figure that wants to exert control even in the minutia of its minions and its prey's life. Like that kind of control and that kind of obsession of the monster is I think the iconic vampire and what makes a vampire truly terrifying, because it's like this thing is like a centuries old undead creature, but why does it care about me so much? Why does it care about why is it trying to control me so hard? And I think that's where the horror comes from for the vampire, for me at least.
Because it can.
Yeah.
Because it lives forever and has nothing better to do. Leon in chat has a question that's kind of along the similar lines of what I've been asking. Question, is there a specific monster type, like humanoid, aberration, etc., that you're drawn to, and why?
Call myself out. I do enjoy demons in that regard, or fiends, because you can really get like evil, and evil with abandon, in that regard. But I think I enjoy aberrations a lot, simply because you have so much flexibility in playing with the weird. So it's between those two. So it depends on how much control I want to exert on myself.
I think my favorite, as a DM, what I like to run are, like I said before, the mimic monsters, of things that it lulls you into a false sense of security before like ensnaring you and the fight happens. I think what's scariest to me is any sort of fey creature or demon. Fey, because like this thing is like, there are a set of rules which you can use to navigate this interaction, and it will leave you alone. You will not die. But if you step out of line even the slightest way, it'll be like, all right, now I'm taking your bones.
I've never thought of Faye that way, but it's so true, and it really is scary when you put it that way.
Oh, they can get so petty too. Yeah, you can really push it to its extremes, and it's funny to watch your players kind of tiptoe around them in that regard.
One of my players is an Archfey warlock, and their patron was the Earl King of Germanic myth, and it's very fun to play with that kind of duality of Fey, of like, he's the Lord of the Hunt, and he is very noble and very regal, and like the majestic elk, with moss hanging from its antlers. It's like it inspires a sense of wonder in the forest. Also, TW for child endangerment coming up if somebody wants to meet.
Oh, thank you for that.
The Earl King, the myth is that it lures children into the woods to steal their souls. It is like he is far and above a child killer. And I think that's where the horror comes from, because it's like you're interacting with this thing and you're like, oh, he seems so nice. I mean, what's the issue? And then you go, oh, he kills children. Yeah. And I think that horror is that duality of, it reflects kind of like humanity in a certain extent, of like, oh, I never would have expected out of this person who's like, a criminal. But it's like, yeah, I mean, people have dark hidden secrets all the time. And it kind of reflects that.
So we've been sort of talking about all sorts of different things that inspire in terms of already existing monsters. But I want to broaden that question. In general, where do you get inspiration for your creature creation?
Ooh, where don't you get inspiration for creature creation? I mean, I've got my background in video games. So usually what I'm doing is I'm looking for not necessarily wholesale characters, but different little aspects or experiences that I have from games. Like, you can sit down and be all like, oh, I want to create a monster that's based off of Kirby. Kirby has inhaling abilities, flying abilities, and copying abilities. Either that, or I can just play with one of those abilities. Like, how would I take the inhaling ability of Kirby and put it into an underwater horror setting? Like, getting eventually just sucked in to this monster's, like, mouth.
I'll add that to the Lysa list. I like it. It would be so fun to fight Kirby in D&D, but your DM doesn't tell you you're fighting Kirby.
Yeah, you just add in all these little hints, and like once you have maybe 3 traits that are undeniably curvy, and then you just add in that last bit. Oh, by the way, this character is pink. It's like, oh, the realization hits them like a ton of bricks.
Yeah. But in the meantime, you were busy being terrified by this underwater creature, like consuming and then spitting you out, stealing your powers. Oh gosh, and then you find out it's a cute pink bubble. What about you, Jack? Where do you draw inspiration?
I also play a lot of video games, and my biggest inspiration, I think, is the Soulsborne series, especially like Bloodborne.
Nice.
Everything about Bloodborne is what I want to emulate in my boss fights, of dynamic fights, unsettling imagery, foreboding messaging. Ludwig the Accursed is my favorite boss fight of all time, just because of that intro cinematic, of the person wailing and warning to you to run away as he walks up. It's all those things combined together to create an atmosphere of dread, an atmosphere to where the player's breath kind of catches in their chests right before the boss fight.
So once you're inspired and you get an idea in your head that there's this creature you want to make for D&D, what is your process? Do you start with stats? Do you start with sort of their flavor and lore? Give me, like, feel free to get into the nitty-gritty, like, detailed walkthrough here.
Cool. Yeah, all right. So if I take it from a basic idea first, like, oh, hey, this is an experience I want to capture, versus like, oh, I need to fit this situation that I'm currently in. I start to think about the individual aspects that clearly define this experience. So for instance, if we take this inhaling underwater bubble, for instance, this is something that's going to pull in a creature from a certain amount of distance. It's going to be impossible to get out of unless it lets you out. It's going to have a distinct noise to it, or it's going to hurt in a specific way, just being like pulled in. Having all those ideas kind of written down, even if they don't necessarily match up to mechanics or sort of descriptions, as long as I have those in my head, or like to start with before I start like building out the creature itself, then I can keep going. Sort of answering the logical questions that come out of it, like what sort of body is this creature going to need in order to be able to do this sort of thing? How strong does it need to be able to pull these creatures in? If it's underwater, how deep of the depths is it going to exist in? And what sort of body conditions do you need in order to exist somewhere down that low? Oh, does it need dark vision because it's that low into the water? Okay, let's add that in there too. And the more you kind of keep on playing this question answer sort of game with yourself, more details kind of just start appearing, and it builds itself for you almost.
That's very cool. So just like to kind of summarize what you said, it seems like you really delve into, well, what are the abilities I want this creature to have? What is its environment? What are the ramifications or requirements for it to be able to exist in this way? That's a very cool, sort of like organic way, it feels, to build a creature or let the creature build itself. Jack, what's your process?
My process is, when I sit down, I first imagine, what do I want players to feel when they see this thing for the first time? And when I take that feeling, and I design its abilities around everything about its stat block, from the names of its abilities to what they do to what statuses that inflicts and what kind of damage it does, reflects that feeling I want to create in the players. Taking it for example, I made a creature for elite monsters called the Necroangelus, which is Latin for the undead angel, which is essentially a creature that exists in the Shadowfell that takes the appearance of a solar. And when people are like crying out for help in the Shadowfell, it appears and goes, "Don't worry, I'm here to help you." And as soon as you go, "Oh, cool, we're saved," it rips off the mask, and it's this horrific undead abomination. It's very powerful, like a very powerful CR30 that creates this huge, monstrous predator that will pursue you, and it's even, I think, even if I'm remembering correctly, has the ability to plane shift to follow you if you Ravenloft.
Excellent. Ooh. CR30. That's rude. I like it.
That's really interesting hearing that that's where you start, because that really is in line with you talked about sort of your goals. You like creating cinematic monsters, and so that's a very like cinematics first approach.
Definitely.
That's cool. Do either of you have a favorite creature that you've created?
That I've created. I'll have to think about that one for a second.
We'll let Jack go first.
Is just horror or just any creature?
Any creature.
I created a creature for Titans of Faerun. His name is Daudelphus Maximus, the Duke of Detritus.
Oh.
He is a possum that fell into what's called a pataphysical vortex, imbued with narrative power, who believes he is Don Quixote. So he was mutated into this giant 45-foot tall possum who wears breastplate, has a rapier, lance, a feather in his hat, who fully believes he is Don Quixote. And he is full of style and gumption and swashbuckling bravado, despite the fact that he's just a giant possum. And he's my favorite creature ever that I've ever.
Nothing you said is what I expected to come out of your mouth. Like every 3 words, I was like, what? So can you, so you described what your process was. Can you use this Don Quixote possum as sort of an example of like how your process applied and resulted in this 40-foot tall Don Quixote possum?
Sure. So when I sat down, I was like, for Titans of the Ancient World, I had the crab goat, which was half crab, half goat, all bastard.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
So I need a kind of silly, kind of B movie monster to put in Titans of Faerun. So I did.
Hi, cat. Cutie.
So I sat down and I was like, I like possums. Possums are my favorite animal. They're really awesome and really cool, and they don't deserve all the hate they get. So I was like, I want to make possums cool. So I had just gotten finished reading the SCP Foundation, their entry on Don Quixote as like a pataphysical, a creature, an entity made out of stories and made out of like legend, who exists only in the fictional realm. And I was like, what if a possum made his way into that and got imbued with that energy and thought they were Don Quixote? And then I told I told my artist that, and I believe their reaction was, Jackson, that is literally the most insane thing I've ever heard come out of your mouth. Thank you. And then so I sat down and I wanted to make this huge like cinematic experience of like swashbuckling with this giant monster, as it like, you know, it kind of duels with you a little bit, and its mythic trait even is like the subversion of that, even because he's all bravado, he's all flash and pomp, but then when you reduce him to 0 HP, you see that like that flash of the determination of Don Quixote of I believe so hard in what I am and what I represent that I'm not going to give up without a fight. So his hat falls off, his hair gets all ruffled up and he falls to the ground, and he's like, you may see me as a giant, but the only thing I see is giants, referring to the passage in Don Quixote, and he produces a lance called the Windmill Lance, and the fight becomes a lot more dynamic as he charges at you, screaming spittle and blood coming out of his mouth as the fight renews once more in earnest.
I just want everyone listening / watching to just remember that everything described is a possum.
Yeah.
That was a possum doing those things.
Picturing the screaming, gaping maw of a possum. Oh, it's delicious.
That's the silliest monster. That also, but just like the scale of the creature, you don't get a lot of, I mean, maybe giants, because giants have different personalities, but I feel like you don't get a lot of like suave, swashbuckling, ginormous things, because they tend to be more, they're big and big clumsy boys. Willy, were you able to think of a favorite monster of yours?
Yes, I have. So one of the things that I do enjoy, particularly in in D&D play is throwing creatures around, right? I like seeing creatures move on the field, even if that means I have to throw them myself. And even if it does break the rules a little bit, sure, they can go like 35 feet across the room. Why not? To that extent, we created Radical Eddie. So this is, or the Audacity, if you want to be like super high and mighty about it. But this is a gnoll, and gnolls don't usually have a big shelf life. They usually get like knocked down after a year or two, just by the nature of how they live and whatnot. But this was a gnoll that kept on getting back up, getting stronger, and she just kind of kept on growing bigger. So we created this force of nature. Literally, we don't even treat it so much as a monster as it is sort of like a weather condition, where she's almost impervious to most damage. She could be exhausted if you want to take that route. But she has this raw power that almost rivals Yinogu himself.
Wow.
And a lot of the experiences that we put with Radical Eddie is, well, how do you subvert Radical Eddie in this area? How do you prevent her from, like knocking down the 4 pillars and waking up the Tarrasque? It's a little bit, it's an interesting sort of puzzle in addition to being like a fearsome foe in that regard. And if you do try to go and square up with Eddie, she just tosses you. So that's always fun. And I love this just idea of this gnoll that normally you can punk around, but not this one.
Can you give us a little insight into what the creation process was like for Eddie in particular?
So we were building out sort of like these, not necessarily legendary encounters, but like memorable encounters. Like we had Joyless Reagan, which was actually a friend's idea, which is sort of a creepy clown dream man. Of course, we had another wizard and whatnot, but we needed something in between. And because we already had gnolls in the book at this point, it's like, well, why don't we exemplify gnolls a little bit better? Let's make an iconic gnoll that can go along with this lineup. And because we had these 2 different like spellcastery like encounters already, let's go with something a little bit more brute force-ish. Okay, cool. Let's exemplify the things that I like to exemplify. This thing can throw you. All right, so now we have that. And we kind of just kept on pushing the idea until it was sort of this unstoppable force of nature. And building out the Audacity, like this hungry gnoll that constantly wants to kill and, eat. It just kind of like built itself up like the process from before.
Very cool. So in creating these creatures, or maybe your earlier monster designs that led to these, was there any like particular lessons you feel like you learned from past design projects or experiences?
You can make a monster too powerful. It is possible to make a monster that is too powerful.
Yeah, it happens. It's just an oopsie.
Yeah, I created this thing called the Subjugatus, which was the metaphysical personification of the 9 Hells' ability to subjugate any other outsider creature, like non-mortal creature, and corrupt and becoming a devil. And it's represented by it's like what you have to fight after you kill Zariel, because it's hosted in Zariel. It had an ability. It had an ability called Join or Die.
Oh, that laugh.
Where you could where it essentially goes like, okay, I'll give you a choice. You can either become a devil or you die. And if the players go, I would not want to become a devil. Then they have to make a saving throw, of which the saving throw is the highest they are proficient in. So they use their highest saving throw, and if they fail it, they're just permanently dead, unresurrectable, anything. And that's something they could do every turn, not just like a one-at-a-time ability.
Too much. It's too much.
Oh, don't you just miss that Saber Suck sort of mechanic that you don't have in this game?
That's a very cake or death sort of question. When the cake's not that good either.
Well, you get cool horns, though. I mean,
What about you, Willy? Any lessons you've learned along the way?
Especially when it comes to design, the people who are using your work, especially in a written space, are going to have a different vision than you. So it's kind of cool when you can embrace that. Like specificity in describing things is great, especially when you're working for yourself and you want to remind yourself of that initial sort of like, oh, I have a really good idea and I want to maintain that. But if you can generalize the abilities and make things kind of broad in a way where the person who is using it can add their own sort of experience to it, and then they tell you about it. I mean, yeah, I'm jumping ahead of myself. But if they are able to make the monster that you create their own, and then put that into the world, and then you get by chance actually get to see that for yourself, you can kind of get re-inspired from your own creation that isn't even your creation anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that is a great. I'm running out of words. It's cool to see. I think it's great to see how many permutations come out of a single design. And I think it becomes a lot more useful when it can permutate like that.
I mean,
I think it's
this
the best way to put it.
totally circles back to more in the beginning of our discussion about beholders and why they're so iconic and why they're so great. And a big part of that we talked about was like all the different ways you can use them. Yeah, like you specify a few key things, a few hooks, and let people run with that. I think that's great advice. So I'm going to ask you all if you have other advice for folks watching. But in case you need a minute for the back of your brain to think about that, there was a more specific question that Meredith asked. So Meredith wants to know if there's a favorite monster that inspired you to start writing monsters. So not even necessarily your most favorite iconic monster ever, but what made you want to create creatures?
To create creatures themselves.
To be God.
Mine was growing up having owned every single Godzilla movie on DVD. I love Godzilla. He's a big friend, and just the lore and like hidden messages behind all the Godzilla movies of like power and the humanity's folly of trying to control nature and stuff really inspired me to like create monsters.
Mm-hmm. It's great inspiration.
I'll play in a similar space with that regard. I grew up with Power Rangers, and just knowing about Goldar and seeing this cool like wolfy armored knight person run around, but also just the monster of the week is always unique and weird, and they're always coming up with new ideas. That's to be able to embody that, to take what I've absorbed from that time in my life and then put that onto the page is always a lot of fun. Even now, we're watching Sentai right now, and they're coming up with even more unique ideas for these baddies at this point. So I think that spirit is still very much alive and influencing, like, my writing. So it's not necessarily one creature in particular, but just that aspect of creature making.
Who can forget the iconic pumpkin wrapper of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers?
The only thing I remember from Power Rangers, aside from I really wanted to be the pink Power Ranger, and that I had pink Power Ranger Pogs, was the monster that like ate, I think he ate people, and then they had like their picture on his stomach.
Oh my gosh.
Yo!
That just triggered like such a buried memory in my subconscious. Oh my god, I completely forgot about that monster.
That's so strange. Why'd they do that?
Well, you could easily translate that into D&D as well. Like, oh, hey, all of these NPCs that you've met along the way, now they're just appearing on this creature's body.
Like tattooed on his stomach? Oh, that's so unsettling.
And make them scream, too.
Willy, why'd you do that?
You know, you push these ideas. What are the consequences of that?
Or the monster that steals people's faces, because there's a moment in Power Rangers where they could go, oh, Buzz and Skull, you guys are still here, and they grab their shoulder and turn them around, and they don't have a face anymore. That
classic. So
endless
classic.
trauma from that. You know.
Oh gosh. Okay, so we've talked so much about inspiration and like the process of translating that inspiration into creatures. Was there anything, like any advice that you had for people who want to do monster design that didn't get you come up just from the questions that we were asking?
Don't be afraid and just do it. Stat blocks, again, I have a big love for stat blocks. They are so easy to pick up and put down. If you have an idea for an interesting mechanic, you can even stick it onto an existing stat block, throw it into play, see how it goes. And if you like that, you can translate that into its own unique sort of creature. Or if you don't like it, it's already out of the game. It's not something that's going to dramatically affect your entire experience in a campaign, right? It's such a delicious play space to be in, monster making, because of how easy it is to mess up but still have a good time with it, you know? And the more you do it, the better you can speak the language of monster making, and the more refined your ideas become over time.
Good advice.
Advice for people especially who think that like stat blocks are an imposing and difficult thing to do is, I would advise them to take a look at the SCP Foundation and the way they tell stories with their containment logs, because the stat block is exactly the same way. You're telling an entire self-contained story within that stat block. Yep. And if you treat it like a story, it becomes so much easier to create and shape it to become like the perfect monster, what you want it to represent.
Good advice as well. I bet there's a bunch of people who find just the writing of the stat block and approaching it very intimidating because it looks like just a bunch of numbers, and numbers can be intimidating. So I love the idea of thinking of it as just a different format of storytelling, because it totally is. Well, with that, unless folks have any other questions, let me just double check. I think we got the two that came up. Yes. Let's go ahead and do some outros.
Sure.
We'll start with Jack, and feel free to plug any projects monster related or not, and whether they're not on they're on the DMsGuild is totally fine. Just let folks know what you are up to.
Okay. I am Jackson Lewis, at honeybadger3495 on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter to see me tweet about animals that I sincerely think I could beat in a fist fight. And you can check out Cryptids Inc. coming to DTRPG sometime in early to mid-July. If you like monsters, you're going to love Cryptids Inc. And you can check out some releases I have coming out at the end, some Van Richten style releases at the end of June as well. But yeah.
Nice. I'm really excited for your cryptids creations. Cryptids are just so cool. I mean, talking about weird monsters.
Okay.
And Willy.
They can find the Willy Boo at the Willy Boo, fun posting online and having a good time. And we were going to be bringing to you tomorrow one Build-A-Ware workshop, but then we discovered that there is a supermoon happening next Wednesday. So we are going to release the Build-A-Ware workshop on the DMsGuild on the full moon next Wednesday. So that is just a big resource of custom were creatures, not necessarily the werewolf. It can be any sort of thing that your heart desires. In testing, we had a were car, and that was really cool. These are both player options and monsters you can fight if you want, or monsters you can just have a race with or a baking contest with, because they are people and they can have a whole bunch of multitudes. But it contains plenty of bestial features to make your own stuff, and plenty of tools that you can play with right out of the box, including a Draco Rat. But we won't talk about the Draco Rat right now.
I just want to hold a werecar's hand. That makes seem fun. Thank you both for joining twice to talk monsters. This was really fun. I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I guess I'm out of practice. But I'm Lysa Penrose. I'm the brand manager over at Dungeon Masters Guild, which is a 5th edition marketplace where you can find all sorts of rules, adventures, player options, and more, or even create your own. You can follow Dungeon Masters Guild at DMsGuild, at DMs_Guild, very important, on Twitter or Instagram. We also have a Facebook group for creators, and you can follow me personally at Lysa Penrose pretty much everywhere. I hope that this chat inspired you all to make something horrifying. And if so, I hope you'll upload those onto Dungeon Masters Guild so we can all enjoy your creations. Thank you, Jack and Willy, again for joining. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.